So we might as well just sort of press on here, and then probably the next session we go back to some more experiments, show you the experiments. Just to sort of complete the story, I guess, really, is, we had these pictures before where we can see, the rings pictures the first stage and the arms pictures the second stage. And there's this sort of question that comes up in the third lecture of the agriculture course. Steiner talks about these elements of protein: hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon and oxygen. We've already sort of discussed this, about how they are these anchors of these activities into physical substance. And he goes so far as to say that the chemical constitution of any environment tells us about the energetic activity of that environment. And so this is linking, this together. It's not a separate, I hope all of that's been impressed that, this isn't some waffly energetic thing, but this is real electromagnetic stuff that's standing with nature. And so the question comes, I had all of those charts going, and this chap, Dave Robson, out of Oregon, sort of said, well, what about what Steiner says about hydrogen, nitrogen being the anchors of these things? And it was like, oh yeah, well, that's important. And so, when I looked at that, all of a sudden I noticed that these are the positions of these elements here. And when we look at the elements, actually what we start to see is that these are all cations over here. So they're all positively charged elements over this side. And these are all negatively charged elements over here. And in chemistry, you have like an extra electron, and then you move to the next element and there's 2 positive charges, and then 3 positive charges, and then 4. And they want to always equalate, basically, an element. And so what we get is that these guys are 2s, so they'll join with another 2 to make 4, to find that balance. And what comes out of the picture is that these are +2, these are -2, this is -1, +1, and so there's this polarity that's existing in the elements. We don't have to make this up. All we've got to do is observe it. And so what sort of came was that we actually have these arms with nitrogen sitting at the base of this arm, and so this is minus. This is now pointing south, -1 and +1 over here, and so it sort of struck me that we sort of have these arms here, which sort of suggested to me that we sort of have this third layer of organisation that's taking place in the periodic table. We already have these other 2, the rings and those arms, and this sort of becomes this third layer. Now, at this point, I hadn't quite got it about the 3 worlds story that Steiner talks about, but I had found these 3 layers showing up in different things. And at a very basic level, we have the cell division. We have a cell, it starts to pulse and it divides. So there's these sort of 3 stages that are taking place. And so what became really evident, of course, is that chemistry, it manifests on the manifest layer. So we've got this archetypal layer, the galaxy, the spirit. We've got the planetary layer, which is the forces behind matter, and then we have this manifest layer. And that's where chemistry is. It's right, it is manifest energy. And so in chemistry, in manifestation, we have polarity. So we get this sort of positive and negative showing up. And so I sort of realised that this is the third layer of chemistry, and that it's much more physically orientated. And so that was just an observation that I made there, and so this picture develops. Now, the next step, of course, is you can put that together. So they're the three layers, basically, and we understand them in this sense that we have the cell, it starts to pulse, and then it enfolds and creates, inside, something, a separate entity inside the other. So, we get this picture. So when we're looking at calcium, it's on this earth etheric ring here. It actually is the internal etheric sitting here, and then it's sitting actually here on this etheric arm. So it's etheric. So it's the most etheric element, and as we know, that's this element that's coming out of life. So it just is adding this third sort of perspective. Now, as these things happen, I was sitting around, and that's just putting it on there. But I had this question. Okay, we've got this image that is sitting there, and it's just, this is what is, and here's the world physical arm here. And I was thinking, how can we look at this so that it's more related to us, to the internal processes of life forms, rather than this is just the chemistry that is existing. How does it relate to us? And I thought, well, this is related to the world physical, the external physical. Well, why don't we orientate it off the internal physical and see what happens? So, just an artistic process, and that's what we get. Now, what happens is, here we are, carbon. Carbon becomes this base element that it's sitting on, and silica's sitting straight underneath it as this sort of base element. And so it just changes this orientation. But what we can see here is that we also, when we go to Hauschka in Nature of Substance, he tells this wonderful story about these three spheres in nature. We've got the atmosphere, and we've got the oceans, and we've got the earth. And in the earth, the predominant elements are calcium, silica, aluminium, and phosphorus. He says they're the dominant elements in this geosphere. When we go to the ocean, sodium chloride, magnesium sulfate are these dominant elements. And then, of course, when we go to the air, we have hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And so he sort of paints this picture of these three sort of great spheres. But we have, aluminium phosphate, and we have sodium chloride, and we have magnesium sulfate. So you have these sort of elements. Now, when we do this, here's aluminium phosphate, here's magnesium sulfate, here's sodium chloride. And the hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen is sitting in this sort of area. And of course, there's boron there. And so, these are these sort of basic elements that that we see in life. And the next thing that sort of happens here is that, so when we look at this picture, what we've got is aluminium, silica, and phosphorus. So where do we find that? We find that in clay. You know, aluminium silicate, and it really locks up the phosphorus into all those little layers, really strong. And then when we come up to this next layer, we have carbon. So carbon, of course, is the basis of humus, and humus is where you find stable boron and nitrogen. That's where it stabilises. And so we've got humus sitting here, and then when we come up to this next layer, we've got calcium, magnesium, sulphur and selenium. Well, of course, this is involved in the leaf growth of a plant. You know, magnesium, sulphur, the calcium makes things bigger. And then when we come up here, if we want fruit production in a chemical system, we add potassium chloride, don't we? And so we've got the potassium is up here, but we've got this sodium chloride sitting here. So within this periodic table, we've actually got the structure of a plant. We've got the soil, we've got the humus, we've got the leaf, we've got the fruit sitting there. We're just observing this, we're just looking. But that's what pops out when we turn it 45 degrees. And so it's, you know, isn't that interesting? Now, where are we? Okay, so, you know, with this we can start to look at these sort of our chemical terms, which we're already dealing with, you know, with nerve sense and rhythmic and metabolic, but in alchemy terms, you know, salt, sulf, and mercury and sulf is what's sort of taking place there. The salt is this process of crystallization, and the sulf is this process of burning off and turning back to gas, and the sulf is the process sort of in between the two, really. But, you know, we can start to see this taking place with this, all these earth elements, and these are the noble gases here, you know, who are quite independent and really don't need anybody else, and so on. But this picture becomes sort of more interesting when we look at the metallic states of the elements. So this is just looking purely at their physical phenomena. And what happens, this is looking south again, what happens is that the brown are all the metals. So we've got all the metals over here, and the green, I think they're called non-metals. And then these are all the gases in blue, and then this is the noble gases here. And so what we can see in the picture, if we're looking at this salt and sulf polarity, is that here's all the salt, you know, all the solid metals, and over here is all the gases. So of course this is going to be salt, and this is going to be sulf. And the same that sort of happens this way, that we can see that we have denser elements here than we have up on the top here. So, you know, as I say, just looking at it, we sort of see that the phenomena of the chart, when it's in a circle, we're starting to get this differentiation that's taking place between solid and gas. Now, the next sort of conversation took place where if we look at this salt and sulf here as an axis, then we have these three arms down each side here, and we can start to sort of see that this is a, you know, salt over here, and sulf over there. And so we get this differentiation of a sulf, and then this is the mercury sulf, and this is the sulf, and over here the cell sulf and the mercury sulf and the cell. So we're getting this, how can you call it? We're just adding texture to the story and sort of in a sense gaining images of the activity of these different arms of the chemistry. Now, I hadn't quite sort of got it when I did all these pictures that really that third layer of activity should be on this picture. And I think I did that in my chemistry book. We did that just to bring that in. But it's, you know, it's just giving us this reference to be looking at how these elements are working in another way. Now, there's a book by Charles Walters and Dr. can't remember his name, and it was called Chemicals for the Genetic Code, something like this. And so they were actually looking at all the subatomic particles, and yeah, Richard Orley, that's it. And they were looking at all these elements, and it was interesting that they tell their story, and cobalt is one of their sort of primary elements that helps sort of drive all these other elements in biological processes. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that this story, when you sort of look at it, does describe biological processes in a way a lot better than the previous chart, which is general. It's just telling us about chemistry and the energetic activities of chemistry. But once we come into biology and start looking at the interactions inside physical organisms, this relationship here starts to, give some very interesting correspondences. And so, I use this as well as a sort of another reference system. And what's really quite fascinating is we sort of come to Steiner's story, and we've got these bodies. Here's the physical body, the etheric body, the astral here. And this picture is actually made out of all of Steiner's medical lectures. I haven't read 100, but I probably read 60 of them. And so in my reading and rereading of those, putting all that information together, this is this sort of conglomerate of all this activity. And we're using this structure that we found in that previous picture. So we're looking here at the physical ring, right? That's the physical ring there. And these are these elements that Hauschka talked about as these sort of foundation elements of these realms in the Earth sphere. And so if we use that as a sort of basis, we've already seen this picture here where we could see those sort of base energies taking place. But so we come back here and we have those there, and we start looking at some of these other references that Steiner's using. And of course we can place the planetary activity into these, and you can see this is where I've got these elements here in this seasonal picture that is coming out of that alchemical chemistry picture. And again, through the season, how these elements are becoming active, and in this time in the autumn, phosphorus is being fixed into the earth, during this time. And through the springtime is the magnesium, lots of leaves, lots of photosynthesis and so on. And, the question is then, how are we seeing this? But at sodium chloride, this is coming through that fruiting period that we're seeing those influences of those elements being expressed. So it's a really interesting sort of reference process that develops out of this. So I think at this stage, I'm really just, giving you this as a sort of something to look at and see how it sort of works through. Oh, this is an interesting point that we sort of need to probably make, that when we look at the trace elements in the periodic table, we were talking, about how we have these three groups of elements, and there's this interesting phenomena which Hauschka points out in Nature of Substance, that when we are looking at these elements, there's a weird phenomena that occurs in the periodic table. And it's about hardness and melting point. So this chart is based upon atomic weight. So what that means is that as we move along these lines here, we're adding a proton and a neutron to the nucleus, and we're sort of adding an extra electron to the outer ring as we move along here. So it's all about atomic weight, the sort of mass of this element. But what happens is that when we come to calcium, and as we go along here, the hardness and the melting points tend to increase with the atomic weight, as you'd sort of expect, right? But what happens is we come to calcium, and then the next hardest element is actually zinc. And then it comes back this way, and then it sort of picks up here and runs along here and comes here and then jumps back here and comes back over here. So when we're looking at this whole phenomena of hardness and the melting points, there's a flip in here. And to really see it correctly, we have to sort of flip this stuff over. And so what that means is that what I've done is all of the trace elements are sort of sitting in here. There's a picture of this. That's that all is one picture that we've got. Okay, so what we've got in this picture in page 48 is that we're putting the major elements as the axis, the major feature of the circle. And so where do the trace elements fit? Remember, there's that big lot of trace elements. So they actually fit in that little area there. That quadrant of the periodic table is where all of those trace elements fit. And so what I've done here is I've pulled them out and then I've flipped them over. And so what we can then do is it comes around here and then we read it around this way, and then it goes off again, and then it comes this way. And so we're following the hardness and the melting points in doing that. That's what we're following sequentially, not the atomic weight. And then when I come to making these a circle of their own and sort of putting it onto this pattern, I'm flipping it back up. I'm actually just moving it over to here and flipping it back up so that we have the same reference. And so this is where we actually, get the calcium and the copper sitting in the same place, and so on. Silver sits in that same place. And so this is not unique to me. There's been one other group, I think there was a group in the 50s and then another couple of people in the 70s that had a go at chemistry from a Steiner point of view. And of course, they all do this because of what Hauschka has found. And so there's the point being, though, what are the trace elements doing? The major elements, you know, nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, they're the big elements of life, as it were. They're the big structural elements. And what the trace elements are doing, they're stimulating biological pathways. You know, like, well, iodine's not a good example because it's a major element. But we've got zinc and copper and cobalt and iron and these things. And chromium, for example, is really implicit in diabetes. You know, it sort of helps push that whole pancreas activity and works against diabetes, basically. And so all of these things are these little spark elements that lead to life. So they're elements of life. And what's so fascinating is, you know, we've got the archetype and we're moving into life. And so there's this lemniscate process that's appearing. It's just there. I'm not making this up. It's just there. And so, you know, we've got this flip that occurs. And then when it came to the rare earths, I sort of thought, oh, we flipped them too. But then years later, I came back and looked at them and studied them, and they're not active in life. They're really toxic to life. You don't find them very much in process. And so they actually just stay the way they are, basically, as a circle. But these trace elements do this flip. Interesting phenomena, really, is all I can say about that. But it's something to observe. And, you know, when we're looking at these trace elements, we, you know, where are we? Here. So we've actually got the sort of calcium comes in here through the zinc around the process here and back out through the scanadium over to this gallium, I think. Now, what we can do is, because we've got 10 elements, what we can do here to identify their quality a little more is see how they relate to the planets. And because we've got 10 elements in astrology, when we're dealing like medieval astrology and stuff that didn't know about Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, one of the organisations was that you have the 5 planets and then you'd have the sun and the moon as these sort of parents that are standing separate. And so we can apply that organisation of those planets to these elements and identify quality. And Venus is, you know, classically associated with copper. You know, Mars is the iron and so on, but Venus is associated here with copper, which is interesting. Mercury is zinc, this sort of thing. So it's just a way of gaining reference on all these things. And it's interesting that, as we sort of go through this process, these are the harder elements over here, and I think they're the ones that are sitting. Where are we? I think these are the ones that are sitting in here, which is this world physical. So the harder elements are actually sitting in the world physical, whereas the elements that are sitting in the etheric sphere are these softer elements that are associated with life and fertility more. You know, so they're sitting there, they're just in the place, you know. It's a little bit crowded, this one, but you know, what we're doing is looking at these planetary aspects of these different elements. This is actually the rare earths here, and of course there's 14 of those, so that means that's the 7th harmonic, 2 lots of 7, 14. And so when we look at them in a circle, we can apply this system of the planets that we find elsewhere in Steiner's work and gain this idea of these energies of these elements. Now, this is the moon down here, moon 1, moon 2, and what's quite fascinating about those elements down there, CE and LU, is I use those for sleeping drops. Because this process, in a way, this is actually Saturn here, and so we gave that story about when you die, you go out through the planets, and you sort of go through and rework all of your past life, and here you sort of talk to Chiron about what's going on, and so here you're coming back in now, building up. So this is force through here, and this is substance through here, and so you're building up your next life as you come in, and so this is birth there, and so this is sleeping like a baby, interestingly, and then once you're born, you then go through this process of living your life, and so you know, you've organised all the forces to come together, to come into life, and then this is you're going through the Mercury phase here, which is sort of working out your projects. Like this can be a project as well in your life, so that you're working to building the project, and then you're putting the project into action. So your life is being put into action. And in this first stage, you're sort of implementing it. You're running around with Mercury, sort of working out how you're going to make your project work. And then you come to the Venus and you're finding the people that are going to help your project work and how it's all going. And funnily enough, when you come to the Sun, this axis across here is really indecisive if you stand there. And a homeopath, Jan Schulten, when he was talking about these elements, he said this element here, promethium, is the only element he could never find a purpose for. Interesting. And the same when you come up here, what happens on this axis is, okay, you're defining what are you wanting to do, what's the thing that you're wanting to work on, and the Jupiter sort of says, okay, we're going to adapt that to the needs of the time. Okay, here we go, we can take some action to get this thing moving. And when we get to promethium, we sort of go, oh, are we right? Where are we going? Is this the right thing to do? We should reconsider what we're happening. You know, there's this real indecision there. And then you sort of get it. Okay, we're right. So then you move on to the, let's start pulling all the resources we need together and doing what we need to do to get to birth. And then as we come up here, as I said, we're putting this thing into action, finding the people to help us. And at this point here, again, we reconsider, how are we going? How's our project happening? What do we have to do to make this thing work? So that when we come to Mars, it's all on. It's all about doing this thing and making it happen. So that when we get here, Jupiter 2, this is where we start reaping the rewards and start getting the success. And so this is a place I really like to stand on in the circle and sit and just hang out there a wee bit. Because at both these, like it just turns out the place I sit in our living room, which is a circle, is this Mars 2 spot. And that's where I sort of do an awful lot of work, you know, just happens to be that. But I really do make an effort to just hang out in this Jupiter 2, and it's success. And then we come to Saturn 2, which is the ending. And funnily enough, it's quite a weird place because, yeah, everything's coming to an end, but the point is there's a sadness with that because it's coming to an end. And there's also a, what am I going to do next? It's like, And so there might be some karma or whatever, but there's this sense of, boy, this is a bit challenging, and the main feeling is it's all coming to an end and I don't know what I'm going to do next, is the real negative in that space. But this space over here is really good for this feeling success. And if you're unclear about doing something, what should I be doing with my life, you need to go sit in here, because this is Saturn 1. This is the impulse. This is the archetypal impulse of the species that will carry on through the whole process, and sit on this guy here, which is the Jupiter, which is how we can do it. We've got the impulse, now this is how we can start to implement this into our into our life, but there's an optimism there. If you're depressed, go and sit there, because it's actually uplifting and sort of, possibility, things are possible. And so, this is a really useful sort of interpretation of the circle and how to use that. Now, we've been talking about the circle going this way, but the circle can also go this way. And that's how it's sort of sitting, in the bigger picture. And so this becomes the beginning point, and then you work through this way, and so this becomes the end point. So if this becomes a birth point and you're running around here, then this becomes a death point. And so when we're looking at this moon process, we've got this sitting here as a birth process in both systems, but this is the death process. So this is the sleep of the dead. So I put both of those together so that you sleep like a baby and sleep like the dead. And I've got a group of people that use this all the time just to put them to sleep. So it's really quite a fascinating sort of process, really. But these two cycles are quite different in character. So we sort of have two cycles here. We have this sort of natural cycle that when we look in the periodic table, it actually starts here and runs around this way. But then we have this other, what I call manifest cycle, based on Saturn as the starting point, where it runs this way. Both are right. Now, one of the sort of, premise that I sort of came to is, when you get this sort of dichotomy or apparent contradiction, I've learned to say, where is it right? Not this is right and that's wrong, but where are both right? How are both of these things right? And this one, as I say, is the sort of archetypal circle. And so when we sort of put all this into the zodiac here, what we see in Callisto with the sequence of the manifestation of the species in zoology, they run here from Cancer around in this way, and this is the mammals. So this is protozoa, this is mammals. So this is a sort of a natural archetypal cycle, whereas this one here, I was talking about you doing something in your life. So this is a purpose one. So again, archetype, manifest. They're two different ends of the stick, but they're both right. And so it's just interesting. That's a phenomena. And so this picture, which you'll have somewhere, has these planetary structures. And I should show you a picture as to why this is valid, why this planetary organisation is valid. Well, yeah, once we're into this side of this story, we are actually looking more at our chemical processes in chemistry, yeah. But they are more involved in living processes, rather than... yeah, yeah. Once we come into the biological processes, this organisation describes it better than the other one. And so it's just got a lot more sort of real imagery in it, really. So I guess the best way to describe what we're doing here now is that at the planet level that we were talking about mostly, we had the Moon and Mercury and Venus, Sun, Mars, right? That's the planet level. Now what we're going to do is we're going to jump up to the zodiac level, the 12-fold level, and look at how the planets organise at that level. And what we find is where we're actually putting the zodiac here, just like that, Steiner and Callisto, well, they use quite a few different zodiacs. And the zodiac that Callisto uses for the animals starts at Cancer and runs backwards around to Leo. Now, Hauschka, when he does his chemistry, he starts at Leo and I believe runs backwards around to Virgo. And Steiner, in his social work, in his threefold social order and anything you could find in the intellectually handicapped homes, starts at Virgo and runs back around here through to Libra. So they're using all sorts of zodiacs, is what I'm saying. There's this Aries zodiac that runs this way around to Cancer that we use. That's not the only zodiac order, is really the story. And there's a thing called precession of the equinox. And so what this is that our spring equinox point moves backwards 1 degree every 72 years. And so what that means is it takes 2,146 years to go through one sign. And so this marks out these great ages in human evolution. And so at the moment, we're in the age of Pisces. And so here we have it here, that this spring equinox point is in Pisces, and it's about 3 degrees Pisces. No. Various things have gone into Aquarius, like Pluto, but this is the spring equinox. And of course there's debate about this. There's 3 different systems. One's Persian and one's, I don't know, something. One's Greek. Sorry?
Our spring or the northern spring?
Well, it's northern hemisphere spring equinox. And it's about, the one I accept is 3 degrees. So 3 72s is about 250 years. So we are still 250 years away from the spring equinox going into Aquarius. So we're on the cusp. We're feeling the vibe. And so when Aquarius is set off, like Pluto moving into Aquarius at the moment, that stimulates that Aquarius vibe. But we're suffering at the moment from Neptune just going into Aries. And you might have noticed an uptick in the glorification of war in the last month. This is Neptune in Aries. And last time Neptune was Aries, we had the American Civil War as one of the manifestations of that. So there is this war thing that comes with Neptune in Aries. So the point being here that we have this archetypal zodiac that Callisto's using to tell us about this archetypal development of the animal kingdom. It's a pretty fundamental, basic sort of structure. And when we look at that and we look at the planetary rulers of each of those signs of the zodiac, we can see that 2 are ruled by Saturn, 2 by Jupiter, 2 by Mars, 2 by Venus, 2 by Mercury, and the Sun and Moon here. And so we sort of have this organisation, and Leafgood in 1951, who's a doctor, gave all these lectures to the biodynamic people trying to get them over Wachsmuth. And he talked about this whole process of how we have an incarnating stream of planetary activity and an excarnating stream. And so this is like force, these are all forces, and this is all substance over here. And so, you know, we're just getting this definition. And so here we have it, this double planetary system just sitting in the zodiac. And now the question comes, we can see why we would begin a zodiac at Cancer and move it around and bring it back here to Leo. That sort of makes sense. But why are we beginning a zodiac at the division between Mars and Jupiter? Why would you do that, you know?
Why would you do it?
Because it's not like if there was a crossing line through here and you were using the equinoxes as the medium of reference, then that would make sense. But this is sort of nowhere land, you know. And so it's sort of a very abstract reference. And of course the tropical zodiac, the constellations are real. We look out there and we can see those organisations of stars. But 2,000 years ago, I think it was Ptolemy, who sort of said, hey, we can, 2,000 years ago, the spring equinox was actually at Aries. And so he said, why don't we just fix that point at Aries for the spring of the Northern Hemisphere every year, and we'll just mark off 30 degrees. And so that was the beginning of the signs of the zodiac. And because the equinox is moving 1 degree every 72 years, the constellations and the signs are now 30 degrees apart, pretty much. And so we've got this quite abstract reference, which is based on the Northern Hemisphere spring equinox. You know, pretty arbitrary stuff, really, that we're going to class as the beginning of a zodiac, and we're going to mark off 30 degrees from there. So it's lost its connection to the archetypal reality, which is constellations. But what do we use the signs of the zodiac for? We actually use them to describe human psychology. I'm an Aries, you're a Taurus. This is talking about a psychological standpoint. Now, we can use them for Aries the head, and Taurus the throat, and Gemini the chest, and all this sort of reference, which is again talking about manifestation, you know, the organisation of manifestation. But ultimately, we're talking about this really abstract thing called human psychology. And so it's that same story that we've got the archetype sitting here, being the constellations, and we move all the way over here to manifestation, and we're using the signs of the zodiac as a reference for this very human thing. So if humans didn't exist, the signs of the zodiac wouldn't exist. That's the point. They're a human-made reference system to describe a human phenomena, as opposed to this archetype over here, which is talking about the constellations and how they're referencing the evolution of the whole animal kingdom. So it's a much sort of broader but, you know, archetypal reference. So it's just, again, something to observe. You know, what's going on here? But it actually shows the value of this double planetary reference. And this is what Leafgood shows us and talks about in this book. And the interesting point is, though, that in the agriculture course, Steiner doesn't use this one. He flips it and we start getting these polarities taking place. And so here again, here's the cosmic substance and the earthly forces and the cosmic forces and the earthly substance here. And this is that picture that we got in the 8th lecture yesterday. And once we put those planetary references onto that, then we can see that there's a flip has taken place here. See this? There's a flip. This goes boof, like that. And the interesting point is, once we start looking at that third stage, which we were looking at, what happens is that there's another flip that goes that way. And so when we're talking about the nature cycle, which I didn't make a lot of emphasis on, we actually have the earthly force phase, which is from winter through to spring. And then we go into this, earthly substance phase. And then we come into the earthly force phase up to summer. And then we come into, in a sense, the astral phase, which is bringing the extra light. And then we move into the cosmic force phase, which is this sort of consolidation of phosphorus, really, into the Earth. And so we actually have these 3 planetary patterns that move with Steiner's stories. We have Leavegood sort of filling this one in for us. This is the agriculture course here. And this is the green, a big part of the green book is actually dealing with this pattern here. And so it's again just this reference of these 3 worlds. And the big story with all this is, where are we in the game is what we're looking at. When we're looking at a story, and we've got these 6 layers in the circle, but we've got these 3 different ways in which these things can work. And, so we're playing 3-handed, 6-dimensional chess is what the game is that we're being given here, And as I said, in that vortex picture, we had preparations for every one of these layers. And so, this is giving us a tremendous realm of creativity available to us, And I've got to say, let's leave this for about 150 years and see what's happening here. Because the potential is sort of enormous, really, I can see the potential, but I don't have enough time or resources to sort of do anything with it. But again, it's just, this is why people think the agriculture course is not understandable. Because on the one hand, you're getting this picture, and then in the agriculture course, Steiner is talking about, anybody that's read it, you get the first lecture and he's talking about cosmic and earthly, and the inner planets and the outer planets, and you go, oh yeah, that's right, that we got it. Here's the earthly processes and there's the cosmic processes. So yeah, we can do that. We've got that. And then we get to the second lecture and he's talking about forces. He's talking about all these active forces that are taking place. And all of a sudden he says the inner planets come from above and the outer planets come from the Earth. And you sort of go, whoa, hang on a minute. And most people don't know much astrology, so they sort of, ooh, right. And then we carry on and we talk about the 3rd lecture and protein, and the 4th lecture and 500, and the 5th lecture is all about the compost preparations, and the 6th lecture we actually start dealing with pest and disease problems. So this is manifest problems. Lecture 2 was forces. Now we're talking about manifest problems, and all of a sudden he says the inner planets come from below working upwards and the outer planets work from above downwards, and people go, whoa, hang on a minute, we heard the other thing over here. How do we deal with this? What are we going to do? And because it's only a few little paragraphs, people sort of go, I won't worry about that. Let's just, get rid of that. And so that's what happens. But I don't understand this. And the point is, he's describing the second layer. He didn't say, I am now going to talk about the second world soul stage of how forces and substance works. He didn't say that. And so we're just sort of lost in the middle of this thing. But this is the organisation that he gives us. And he's, Leavegood, in his book, he started talking, he tells us about the incarnating and the excarnating planets, and then he spends a big section on how this Saturn II process is working in conjunction with this Moon 1 process, and so on. There's all this polarity going on here. And so what Steiner's done is he's flipped it. So now we've got Saturn II, Moon 1, Jupiter 2, Mercury 1. So this polarity structure that Leavegood was talking about, Steiner has now got them sitting together. Just observation, but that's what he's done. And so, you know, the way we move from there to there is we flip a lemniscate, like he's done elsewhere in his writings around the 12 senses. He does this. We saw it happening in the trace elements. We got this lemniscate in the trace elements. And so what he's talking about here are the forces behind manifestation, is what he's talking about. And then when we come here, there's another flip. Now there's a question that shows up in my essays book, that are we just flipping it that way, which is what shows up in a lot of his lectures, or are we actually flipping it back up that way? That's just a little question. But the point being, once we do this, this is the picture that we start seeing in all those manifest stories. You know, that seasonal story we did this morning. I didn't emphasise this, sorry, but that's what's sitting in there, is that we're going through this earthly substance, earthly forces, cosmic substance, cosmic forces rhythm. And that's the rhythm of the manifest layer. So this is that third layer in the three worlds. And, you know, all I can say is, here's the roadmap. And I sort of put it in my book. If we don't want to go mad doing this, then we need to follow these planets. We need to follow how they move to show us the pattern that's appropriate. And as I say, this is the pattern that shows up in all of these, the earlier pictures that I was showing you for this third stage. So what we've got going around here is that, you know, this is where we have the earthly substance, and then the earthly forces, the cosmic substance and the cosmic forces. So this is the picture that comes out of the lectures about physical manifest reality. That's the picture that he's using. And this is how we get there, through this process of following the planets and just lemniscate, and we get there. So, you know, as hoping to help you not go mad, and I appreciate it's a bit abstract, but this is really quite an important pattern in the seasons. When we're working with the seasons, like we were talking about this morning, this is what we find. This is the pattern that's there. And so that's what we have to work with. And how do we get there is the question.